Imagine being the supreme commander of the entire German military. Your nation is collapsing into ruins. Your dictator is gone. Your armies have been smashed into nothing. What do you do then? Do you keep fighting until the final shot? Do you disappear into a freezing bunker beneath the earth? No. Field Marshal G. von Rundt, the highest-ranking officer left in the German military, made a decision that completely enraged the American forces. He packed his finely tailored uniforms, gathered his doctors and personal servants, and settled into a luxurious alpine medical resort deep in Bavaria. He did not see himself as a defeated man. He saw himself as royalty that could never truly be touched. When he learned American tanks were moving up the mountain roads, the proud mastermind demanded that the United States Army send a 4-star general, possibly Eisenhower himself, to accept his surrender with proper ceremony. Over a glass of wine, he expected American officers to salute him. He expected a grand historic event worthy of his rank. But the United States military had a deeply humiliating surprise waiting for him instead. They did not send a famous general. They did not send diplomats or honored officials. Instead, a young American soldier from New York, exhausted by war and covered in mud and grease, pushed open the doors of the luxury resort. Young American did not salute him. He did not care about the polished medals hanging from the German officer's coat. He simply stared at one of the most powerful generals in Europe and calmly told him to gather his belongings, stay quiet, and climb into the back of a dirty American Jeep. It was the ultimate reality check, one that shattered the ego of the so-called master race forever. To understand why this moment felt so satisfying, it is important to understand the staggering arrogance of the man inside that resort. Karl Rudolf Geerd von Rundt was not just another officer. He came from an ancient aristocratic Prussian family with a long military history. He had served Germany since the days before the First World War. He was the perfect symbol of the old European warrior elite, a man who deeply believed in noble bloodlines, rigid military hierarchy, and the sacred honor of the officer class. He was also a ruthless and highly capable strategist. He helped command the invasion of Poland. He took part in the fall of France. He oversaw the massive German assault during the Battle of the Bulge. Even Allied leaders respected his tactical skill. Commanders such as Dwight D. Eisenhower and Winston Churchill considered von Rundt one of the most dangerous military minds in the German war machine. But von Rundt was trapped inside his own massive ego. He believed war was still a noble contest between aristocrats who followed ancient gentlemanly traditions. Because of this arrogance, he looked down on the United States Army with open contempt and disgust. To the aristocratic field marshal, the Americans were not real soldiers at all. He often described them as uncivilized cowboys. He viewed the United States as a weak and disorganized nation filled with merchants, laborers, farmers, and factory workers. In his mind, Americans lacked the deep military traditions of the Prussian elite. To him, American GIs were nothing more than amateurs in uniform and undisciplined force that had advanced across Europe only because of its enormous industrial power. He truly believed that a man of his historic noble rank should never answer to ordinary working-class men, but that ancient worldview was about to collide with brutal reality. By the spring of 1945, the war had completely destroyed the German front lines. In the West, American forces were driving across Germany with terrifying speed and unstoppable momentum. The United States Army had crossed the Rhine River and pushed deep into the southern region of Bavaria. Aging sick and suffering from heart problems, von Rundt withdrew to the quiet resort town of Bad Tölz. He brought his wife and son with him. Inside the peaceful alpine resort, he sat comfortably sipping wine while preparing himself for what he believed would be a dignified surrender captivity. He knew the Americans were advancing, but he believed the American command would recognize his enormous historical importance. He assumed he would be treated as a highly respected prisoner. of state. In his mind, this surrender would happen between men of equal rank, almost like royalty negotiating peace. He had no idea who was truly driving up the mountain roads toward him. The American unit racing toward Battles was the 36th Infantry Division under the United States 7th Army. They were widely known as the Texas Division. If Garrett von Runt represented the peak of old European aristocracy, then the men of the 36th Infantry represented the heart of the American working class. These were the very men von Runt had dismissed as amateurs and cowboys. They were farm boys from the Southwest, odd mechanics from the Midwest, and clerks from crowded cities on the East Coast. They carried no noble family names. They did not march with velvet-covered staffs or ceremonial batons, but what they lacked in aristocratic tradition, they made up for with toughness, endurance, and unbreakable determination. The soldiers of the 36th Infantry had survived some of the harshest combat of the entire war. They had fought through the brutal mountains of Italy. They had endured the difficult landings in southern France for nearly 2 years. They marched, bled, and fought through snow, rain, mud, and shattered towns without rest. By May of 1945, the American GIs were physically and emotionally exhausted. Their olive uniforms were stained with grease, dust, and the dirt of countless battlefields. Their boots were cracked, muddy, and worn down from endless miles of combat. They no longer cared about military ceremony or glorious history. They only cared about finishing their mission, protecting the men beside them, and finally returning home alive. Now these two completely different worlds were about to meet inside one silent room. On the afternoon of May 1st, a small American patrol rolled slowly into the quiet cobblestone streets of Bad Tolz. Leading the patrol was Second Lieutenant Joseph Burke, a 20-year-old officer from New York. Alongside him stood a handful of tired, battle-hardened enlisted soldiers. They had received reports that a high-ranking German officer was hiding inside the local medical facility. Lieutenant Burke and his men parked their mud-covered jeeps outside the large building and walked toward the entrance. Inside the resort, von Rundstadt's personal aides rushed through the halls, informing him that American soldiers had arrived at the front doors. The old field marshal slowly rose to his feet. He did not hurry. He carefully put on his finest tailored field gray uniform. He adjusted the shining knight cross hanging around his neck. He pulled on spotless white gloves. Finally he picked up his field marshal's baton, the diamond-covered symbol of his military power and status. He stood proudly in the middle of the grand room, posing with quiet dignity. He prepared the formal speech he planned to deliver during his surrender. He waited for the doors to open, expecting a senior American general to walk into the room, salute respectfully, and ask for his surrender in proper military fashion. Instead, the doors opened and Lieutenant Burke walked inside. The young American officer was covered in road dust and weariness. His steel helmet hung loosely from his head strap. An M1 carbine rested casually against his side. He looked at the elderly German officer standing stiffly in the center of the room, surrounded by silver decorations and gold medals. Von Runt waited for the grand historic moment he imagined. His head, he waited for the salute. He waited for the Americans to recognize his legendary reputation and importance. But the salute never came. The American soldiers did not snap to attention. They did not deliver a dramatic formal greeting. They simply stood in the doorway, looking calmly at the highest ranking officer in the German military. With quiet professionalism, through an interpreter, Lieutenant Burke politely asked the man to identify himself. Von Runt stiffened slightly, keeping his posture perfectly straight. He formally announced his name and his title as Field Marshal of the German Army. Then he slowly extended his baton and waited for the ceremony to begin. The ceremony never truly began. Silence spread across the room, heavy and deeply uncomfortable. Lieutenant Burke only gave a small nod. There was no grand speech and no formal exchange between famous military minds. The young American officer calmly and respectfully informed the field marshal that he was now a prisoner of the United States Army. Then he quietly told him to collect his coat because it was time to leave. The psychological impact was instant, invisible, and devastating. If the Americans had stormed into the room shouting insults or treating him with cruelty, von Rundstedt could have protected his pride. He could have told himself they were uncivilized barbarians who feared his brilliance, but the Americans were not cruel, and they were not angry. They were simply unimpressed. For a man whose entire identity had been built around ceremony, prestige, and the absolute authority of his rank, the calm indifference of the American soldiers destroyed his entire worldview. The young lieutenant did not see him as a legendary commander or a god of war. He treated him like another prisoner who needed to be processed and transported. As von Rundstedt stared at the tired faces of the American GIs standing in that room, the illusion of aristocratic superiority finally collapsed around him. He realized the shining medals on his chest meant absolutely nothing to these farm boys and mechanics. His noble bloodline carried no value in their eyes. For the first time in his life, his title and rank meant nothing at all. The old world of Prussian emperors and aristocratic warfare had died, defeated by the very men he once believed were beneath him. Von Rundstedt did not resist. He kept his rigid posture, but the arrogant fire had vanished from his eyes forever. He put on his coat, gathered his wife and son, and walked quietly out of the room under escort from Lieutenant Burke and the men of the 36th Infantry Division. As they left the luxurious Alpine resort and stepped into the cold mountain air, there were no brass bands waiting, no crowds gathered to witness a grand, historic surrender. The only sound was the steady rumble of a dusty American Jeep engine outside the building. When von Rundstedt walked through the front doors, he expected to see a warm staff car waiting to transport him to some high-level diplomatic meeting. Instead, the Americans pointed toward the back of a mud-covered Willys Jeep. Von Rundstedt, a man who had once commanded millions of soldiers and helped reshape Europe, was forced to awkwardly squeeze into the cramped rear seat of an Abe Yeruche en Yeruakratkoi infantry Jeep. He sat beside enlisted American soldiers who smelled of sweat, mud, and gun oil as the Jeep bounced hard down the rough Bavarian mountain roads, throwing dust and dirt across the field marshal's spotless uniform. His entire world faded into history. He was taken to an American command post, where he was processed exactly like any other prisoner of war. The Americans confiscated his diamond-covered baton. Eventually he was transferred to Camp Ashan, a secret interrogation center, and later moved to a prison camp in Great Britain. The Americans never physically abused him. They treated him with the basic professional dignity required under international law, but they never gave him the aristocratic admiration and special treatment he had expected his entire life. He spent his remaining years quietly and died in 1953. Yet it is difficult to imagine that he ever forgot that silent room in Ba Toads. The quiet capture of Field Marshal von Rundstedt remains one of the most meaningful moments of the war. It symbolized the victory of ordinary democratic soldiers over the ancient systems of European aristocracy. The military system von Rundstedt served was built on the belief that men were born unequal. It depended on rigid class divisions, blind obedience, and the idea that noble blood alone created true leaders. Common people were viewed as tools to be used and discarded by their superiors. The United States military proved that philosophy completely wrong. The men who defeated one of the most powerful machines in European history were not raised inside palaces or noble estates. They came from ordinary homes, farms, and towns across America. They believed that every man was created equal and that leadership had to be earned through hard work, courage, sacrifice, and mutual respect rather than inherit through royal bloodlines. When a 20-year-old American officer walked quietly into that room and placed a German field marshal under arrest, he proved that free men fighting for a just Cause could outlast the fragile egos of dictatorships and empires. The American GIs did not need gold-tipped batons or aristocratic titles to become great soldiers. They only needed one another and a steady belief in the mission that had carried them across the ocean and through the fires of war. If you enjoy authentic and lesser-known stories from the Second World War, consider supporting the channel and following for more historical stories in the future. Thank you for watching, and may the courage and quiet strength of that generation never be forgotten.